Hey Earthers, Nikki here. Welcome to my review of CALIBAN'S War, which is book 2 of the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey. And as usual, this is going to be a mostly non-spoiler review, which means that I'm not going to give away any major plot twists or character arcs that aren't revealed within the first 50 pages or so of this book. And as you can see, this is a pretty thick book. It's about 600 pages. And of course, since CALIBAN'S War is book number 2 in the Expanse series, if you have not read book number 1, which is Leviathan Wakes, or if you're unfamiliar with the Expanse television show, then maybe you might find out some things that you didn't want to find out. Likely they'll be out of context and won't really spoil anything for you, but still, heed my warning. Speaking of the TV show, if you're a big fan of the Expanse series on Amazon Prime, CALIBAN'S War roughly aligns with midway through season 2 to midway through season 3. So gather round the blue light readers for this episode of iWizard. CALIBAN'S War was published in 2012, and as I mentioned in my last review on Leviathan Wakes, the Expanse series is made up of 9 books, which is complete as of last fall 2021, and also 8 novellas. 3 of the novellas are prequels and take place before Leviathan Wakes, but there is a novella set after CALIBAN'S War, before Abaddon's Gate, called Gods of Risk, which I will review along with Abaddon's Gate. My plan here, since I'm going to be hanging out in this Expanse universe for a while, well, actually, it's really our universe, our solar system in the future, but anyway, since I'll be hanging out here for a while, I'm going to review all the novellas as well, and I'm going to review the prequels after I finish Leviathan Falls, which is book 9. When we open up in CALIBAN'S War, it's been about a year and a half since the end of Leviathan Wakes, or since the Arrows incident. And let's just take a look at the title here. So CALIBAN'S War. Caliban comes from Shakespeare's The Tempest, and Caliban is a half human, half monster. And so that would be referencing the monster in this book. And if you've seen the television series, the monster really looks like, I was listening to Iron Maiden the other day. It looks like this depiction here of Eddie Maiden. You see it? That's kind of what you think of when you think about the monster in this book. As far as setting is concerned, we get to see more of the outer planets as compared to Leviathan Wakes, which mostly focused on the belt. So we get to see specifically some of the moons of the outer planets, but then we also get to see Earth as well in this book. And CALIBAN'S War opens on Ganymede Station. Ganymede, in case you didn't know, is one of Jupiter's moons. And Ganymede is unique compared to other Jovian moons in that it has a magnetosphere. And what magnetospheres do is they are able to block out really high energy radiation. And Jupiter has some high energy radiation coming off of it. So Ganymede is one of the safest Jovian moons as far as that is concerned. So that is where crops are grown. There are all these mirrors set above Ganymede Station to try to amplify and direct the minimal sunlight at the crops, since Ganymede Station is the breadbasket for the outer planets. That's where all their food comes from. Also because of Ganymede's magnetosphere, that's where women go to gestate. So they have really good OBGYNs out there. And so that's really the safe haven for pregnant women in the outer planets. And when this book opens up, we first meet a young girl who is about 4 years old. And of course, she gets kidnapped. She gets kidnapped right before all hell breaks loose on Ganymede. And by all hell breaks loose, I mean that Earth and Mars start fighting each other. And during that skirmish, the mirrors that are over Ganymede Station crash into the agricultural domes. And just before all that happens, we meet Gunnery Sergeant Roberta Draper, and we get her perspective. So I'm going to give you a couple quotes here from the book to set the scene. The figure chasing the 6 UN Marines wasn't wearing an environment suit, nor was it, properly speaking, human. Its skin was covered in chitinous plates, like large black scales. Its head was a massive horror, easily twice as large as it should have been, and covered in strange, protruding growths. But most disturbing of all were its hands, far too large for its body, and too long for their width. They were a childhood nightmare version of hands, the hands of the troll under the bed, or the witch sneaking in through the window. They flexed and grasped at nothing with a constant manic energy. The Earth forces weren't attacking, they were retreating. The alliance between Earth and its upstart brother had been an eternal, unshakable thing once. The belt had been an annoyance and a haven for tiny cells of renegades and troublemakers, as likely to die of a ship malfunction as to be called to justice. Humanity had been alone in the universe. And then, the secret discovery that Phoebe, idiosyncratic moon of Saturn, had been an alien weapon, launched at Earth when life here was hardly more than an interesting idea wrapped in a lipid bilayer. How could anything be the same after that? And yet it was. Yes, Earth and Mars were still unsure whether they were permanent allies or deadly enemies. Yes, the OPA, Hezbollah of the vacuum, was on its way to being a real political force in the outer planets. Yes, the thing that had been meant to reshape the primitive biosphere of Earth had instead ridden a rogue asteroid down into the clouds of Venus and started doing no one knew what. Right from the get-go, we find out that the protomolecule is back in play outside of Venus. Where did the sample come from? And who is pulling the strings? These are major questions throughout the novel. Caliban's War follows 4 primary points of view as compared to the 2 POVs that we got in Leviathan Wakes. And so now I'm going to briefly just go through with you some of the characters and the casting from the show just to give you an image in your mind. Like Leviathan Wakes, the first POV that we get is in the prologue, and it's the character that gets kidnapped. And this time it is Mei Meng. Mei Meng is 4 years old, and she was born with an immunodeficiency, which means that her body does not naturally fight off viruses. And she is kidnapped by her doctor right at the start of the novel. And one detail that I really liked in this television show that I want to point out is that in the TV show, May is wearing this backpack with these cartoon dinosaurs on it called Misko and Morisco. And this backpack does not show up at all in Caliban's War. But why I point it out is I noticed that in Leviathan Wakes, when Holden is on Eros with Miller and he's scared and he's trying to calm himself down, he hums the theme to Misko and Morisco. So I thought that was a nice shout out done by the TV series to Leviathan Wakes. Next up, we have May's father. And so we get his point of view throughout. And his name is Praxidike. He goes by Prax. And Praxidike is actually a feminine name. He was named for one of the moons of Jupiter. And in Greek mythology, Praxidike is the goddess of justice. And yes, he is looking for his daughter throughout this book. He's a botanist and he grew up on Ganymede. And for the last 8 years, he's been working on a genetically modified, low resource type of soybean called glycine quinone. This soybean would require limited light, limited water, limited nutrients, since out in the outer planets, there's not that many resources available. So we want to get the most nutritious content in the soybeans without using abundant resources. And I really like Prax. He has an analytical mind. He has a scientist PhD. He's a systems thinker. So he always approaches every problem thinking about how all the pieces fit together and how they interact throughout. And so I really like his POV because you get that kind of puzzle solving thinking going on. And also his description of the cascade effect and how if you just mess with one piece of an ecosystem, the rest of the ecosystem could fail, especially if it's an ecosystem with low biodiversity like you would get in a station. Okay, next point of view we get is Bobby Draper. And I already mentioned Bobby earlier. Bobby is a Martian Marine, and she has really awesome armor. It's called the Goliath powered armor. So it basically makes her into this super strong soldier. The armor itself weighs a couple 100 pounds and it responds to the slightest motion. It's basically bulletproof. You need a special type of bullets to pierce it. You can go out in a vacuum with it. It protects you from radiation, all that good stuff. Roberta is a super competent soldier through and through. When they describe her appearance, she's very large. She's 150% the size of a typical woman. So she has pretty normal womanly proportions. She's just big. And she went into the military to please her father, who's an MCR veteran, and she's the youngest of 3. Her 2 older brothers did not go into the military. The next POV we get is Christian Avasarala. And as I mentioned in my last review, I was really surprised not to see Avasarala in book 1 because her storyline is told in season 1 of the Expanse, parts of it. And I love her POV because you do get more of a sense of what is going on politically. Okay, what is going on Earth? Avasarala is the assistant to the undersecretary of executive administration. She's a small woman in her 70s. She wears saris. She loves drinking tea, and she is super cranky. On the outside. It's part of her charm, okay? She swears a lot, and she calls it her mask. It's this political mask. It's to make her seem more intimidating. Being in her head, she's always trying to analyze every political situation. She's trying to read between the lines. She's trying to read facial expressions, to keep track of people's breaths, to try to piece together what is really going on. Because the important part is what is not being said, or what is the cover up. And so she is like the third most powerful person in the United Nations of Earth. As far as I can tell, the highest UN government rank is the Secretary General. To give you a sense of her personality, she calls the Secretary General bobblehead to his face. And then the last POV we get is still Holden. One thing I didn't piece together from book one about Holden is that he is literally a farm boy who went out on an adventure. Okay, so it's a fantasy trope, right? So Holden is a farm boy. He has 8 biological parents, 5 fathers and 3 mothers. So he was test tube mixed together using all their genetics and carried by one of the women. At the point we meet him again in Caliban's War, he's been working as a cop, basically, for 1.5 years for the OPA. So for Fred Johnson, chasing down space pirates. So the first Holden chapter we get is pretty fun and light, and he's just on a mission to chase down space pirates still on the Rocinante with his crew. His personality is starting to shift and evolve a bit. After doing this work for the OPA for so long now, he's starting to get a bit of Miller in him. He's becoming a bit of a cynic. Don't get me wrong, he's still an idealist for the most part. And one quote about him kind of sums it up nicely. He's true or not true, he believes it. If he believes something and he believes it is the right thing, he is going to go for it. I'm not going to go through the crew members of the Rosie again in detail, right? That's Naomi, Amos, and Alex. But I just want to say that I still don't get a great sense of their backgrounds or who they are. We get some glimmers of Amos's past in this book. We get like another line of detail of Naomi's past, basically just telling us that she's gotten 2 master's degrees and she turned down a full ride PhD on Ceres Station. And then for Alex, we do get a little bit of his past, like one line, like one thing, but I'm not going to share that with you. I don't want to spoil anything. Let's get into my likes. There are so many, but I'm going to try to limit them as much as I can. And once again, just like Leviathan Wakes, I love the attention to detail. For example, Ganymede is going to be very cold, right? It's far away from the sun. And another reason that it is so important as far as resources are concerned is that there is water ice on Ganymede. And so the walls of the station have this really thick insulation, and the insulation is much thicker near the lower part of the walls where people can reach, and the insulation becomes thinner as you move up toward the ceiling. So you get all these really beautiful ice crystal formations up near the ceiling, and of course you don't touch them because it's going to burn off your skin. It's very, 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 very cold. And another thing that I really liked is that in this future, everyone uses metric units. Yay! Since English units are silly and completely nonsensical, the use of metric units throughout these books has made me just so happy. All right, and then next, as far as the science is concerned, I didn't find anything particularly distracting. I'm trying to enjoy these books, so I'm not digging for inconsistencies or bad science or anything like that. I understand that it's science fiction. And also, I'm not a biologist, so I might have just completely missed something as far as the biology is concerned, but the physics didn't distract me at least. And just some of the examples and details were so specific and really great, actually. So one that I liked particularly was when Prax is describing the cascade effect. He gives an example by using the nitrogen balance. And so how just one little thing that isn't directly related, say, to his soybean crops, if that goes out of whack, then the soybeans die. So if a particular fungus comes in that isn't lethal to the soybeans, but what it does is the fungus takes up nutrients, all right, from the soil, it changes the pH, it'll impact the nitrogen fixing bacteria that gets killed by the presence of the fungus. Then the soybeans become stressed and they turn yellow and limp, and everything is then thrown out of whack just by one little thing, and that's the cascade effect. And I personally really felt for Prax. I identified with his character, and I just loved how he spent much of his point of view like trying to put together puzzle pieces, and he would inductively jump to conclusions pretty quickly, and if anyone else is around him, he'd start to just like describe what he just figured out, and they would all just kind of look at him blinking like, where did that come from? Explain, please. And he'd be like, all right. And so he'd have to reverse and go through his whole reasoning again, but he kind of just puts it together and gets there. I really enjoyed his character. The other thing is he does not have a really good sense of his surroundings, so what's going on around him. So anytime there is some kind of conflict or fight scene, you don't really know what's going on when you get his POV, so he's unreliable with that respect, and it makes everyone else just seem abundantly more competent. So that was a really good strategy by the authors, and all this chaos will be erupting, and he'll like black out, or he just won't know what's going on, and then all of a sudden he'll come back to and look around, and he'll be like, oh, okay, things are good, woo. And another thing that I also liked is Bobby was somewhat portrayed as an unreliable narrator as well. And I don't know if we're meant to take her as unreliable or if it was just another character messing with her. But she does start the novel going through a really devastating event. And she ends up, and she does have PTSD from that. Okay, so she's not really remembering things that she did early on. Another thing that I liked in the Bobby storyline is she does end up going to Earth, and she had never been on Earth before, and so when she walks out of a building without a suit on, she starts hyperventilating without an environmental suit on, because you have to think she's from Mars. She's used to having a helmet on. She's used to having an oxygen supply. So you really panic, like, oh no, I'm in basically low atmosphere in a vacuum, whatever. I am going to die. And so apparently that is a thing that happens. That's a form of agoraphobia that happens to non-Earthers who are also known as off-worlders. I do like the different POV format with the converging storylines. Okay, so we'll get 2 and 2 storylines coming together so that as the narrative and plot starts to pick up, we don't have to just abandon what's going on. We just get 2 different POVs for the events in that storyline. So 2 and 2 come together, and then those 2 converge, right, when near the climax. And so then you just get to stick with all the action, but you're getting 4 POVs with all the action happening. And finally, almost finally, I thought some of the emotional sentiments were expressed better in this novel compared to the first one, and specifically with respects to love. Like, of course, you get Prax's love for his daughter, but you also get some very sad memories of him thinking back about his relationship with his ex-wife. And also you do get some nice thoughts from Avasarala and interactions with her husband that I actually did feel emotionally invested in. And finally, my nerd shout out for likes here. The Martian fleet has a specific type of fast cruisers called the Raptor class. And I'm going to go ahead and just assume that's a shout out to Battlestar Galactica. Now for what I did not like. And this list is much shorter than my likes. And my first dislike is I still don't know too much about the Roci crew members. We know about their temperaments and how they react to situations, but we don't know too much more about them than that, which I find really surprising because Holden's been with his crew for quite some time now, and you would think that he'd at least have some thoughts about the pasts of his crew members. I find it a little unbelievable that they don't talk about that stuff at all. And another thing that I'm putting in the dislikes is that I wanted more, at least interactions with Jules Pierre Mao, because I think he had the potential to be an interesting villain, but we get so little of him that he's not quite believable. He's almost like a bit of a caricature. It's not that extreme, but his villainness, if I want to call it that, is definitely simplified. And then another issue I had is that some of the POVs, at times, the way things were worded, made them seem very similar. For example, there's one chapter in which Holden is thinking about these lizards in the back of his mind, kind of like milking his subconscious, like working his subconscious. And then Bobby has like a very similar thought a few chapters later. And I think that's an oddly specific thing to think about, or an oddly specific way of thinking about that. That was one thing. And also some of the character descriptions were used multiple times. And I know it's just a quick way to get you into the character, but I prefer for some different approaches throughout. But really, that was it. Before I wrap things up with my rating, there's one other thing that I want to mention that is not exactly a dislike, just a comparison to the show. And where is Drummer? When does she come in? She's one of my favorite characters. Okay, vent done. On to my ratings. For story, I rated this an 8.5 out of 10 because it overall is very similar to book one as far as the story and plotting is concerned, except that you don't get that noir aspect that you get in book one, which was just so cool. And the big events in book one are just so big, and there's so many twists and turns that it's really hard to top them. And book two, I'm sorry, did not top them, but it was still an enjoyable read with a fairly tight plot. Was just all this bigger stuff centered around a kidnapping. The plus here is we did get that political / military POV, which I thought was really interesting. Characters, I have rated a 9 out of 10, so that's a bump up from book one, just because the characters do have deeper inner lives here. I thought Miller had a deep inner life in book one, but Holden was lacking. Specifically, I felt like I got a really good sense of Avasarala and Prax in this book, and Holden is beginning to grow in complexity, okay, somewhat, compared to the first book. Bobby, I enjoyed her storyline, and I'd like to learn more about her, but I feel like I didn't dive that deeply into her either. Prose, I rated an 8 out of 10. It was clean, on par with the first book. Same score, I'd say. And for originality, I bumped this down to an 8 out of 10 because it's so similar to the first book as far as plot is concerned. But then the ending of this book is very original and satisfying, and it sets up for book 3 super well. Overall, the sci-fi elements were creative and original in this book and definitely built on book 1. And so that brings me to world building. Once again, I'm rating world building 9.5 out of 10. I am still loving all the details and just want more. So overall, I rate Caliban's War 8.6 out of 10. All right. So that is all I have for you today. And if you want to continue following me on my journey, please subscribe and click the notification button. And I'll see you next time. Bye.